Professor Jayati Ghosh, welcome to SABC News.
It's a pleasure.
Along with Joseph Stiglitz and Oxfam, you've written an open letter to South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa to reject what you have called a misleading and ineffectual compromise proposal that has emerged at the WTO COVID-19 IP waiver negotiations. What are your main concerns?
Well, let's begin with the problem. The issue is that we have a pandemic in which we have not been able to provide the essential treatments or the vaccines required to control it in most of the world because pharma companies have been allowed to retain knowledge which was developed with public resources and public subsidies. The South African government has played a very, very effective and important role along with India in moving for a TRIPS waiver in the WTO. This TRIPS waiver was designed to cover all intellectual property on not just vaccines, but therapeutics, testing, and everything we require to confront this pandemic. And it was designed to deal with not just the patents, but also with industrial design, with trade secrets, with all kinds of other things that can impede the wider production of these essential vaccines and drugs. What we've got now this was resisted first by the US and European countries. We now have a compromise with the Europeans and the United States, which is not really any advance on what is currently existing. It restates the European position. Mostly, there is one major concession. They now recognize that intellectual property has been a barrier to wider production. They were not even recognizing this before. But unfortunately, what this does is just restate the available compulsory licensing clauses in the TRIPS agreement. It doesn't go beyond this. It's limited only to vaccines. It doesn't cover testing. It doesn't cover drugs or any other therapeutics. And it actually does not allow for governments that are trying to bring in the new production of vaccines or any other drugs, the ability to do so without fear of further litigation.
The WTO, let me jump in. The WTO Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, called the compromise deal a major step forward. Is she wrong?
I would say it's a minor step forward. It's a minor step forward as precisely because they have recognized that there's a problem. That's the step forward. It is no step forward in terms of the actual implementation and what it will deliver to countries like the entire developing world. Because, for example, the South African initiative to develop mRNA vaccines on its own will still face legal issues and problems. And there is a further requirement. Not only is it limiting this only to vaccines, right, but it is requiring any country that tries to make use of this to list every single patent that is required. Now, this can go up to hundreds. We don't even know how many patents are required. And it does not cover trade secrets, which is critical sometimes in producing a whole range of these things.
Let me share with you what the former UN Chief Ban Ki-moon wrote this week. He wrote around the same issue, saying the compromise is too narrow in scope, excluding certain countries, and of course, as you've mentioned, covering only vaccines, ignoring the urgent need for other coronavirus treatments. Crucially, he continues, the compromise addresses only patents, not other IP barriers like trade secrets, which are essential for the manufacture of vaccines. Professor Ghosh, talk about some of these trade secrets, right, so that our aunties and uncles at home can understand what we mean.
Well, in South Africa, you should now be very aware of this terrible thing called trade secrets, because South Africa is, with this really exciting work on the mRNA hub, I think creating the possibility, which, under the guidance of WHO, it's creating the possibility for local production of vaccines in Africa, which is something we should all celebrate. But this hub is not safe because a lot of undisclosed data would be locked up as intellectual property that it would actually be able to not access. Or if it does something that somebody else, some company decides is a trade secret, then it can still be subject to litigation. Moderna, for example, is already claiming that its trade secrets are being used in production in this mRNA hub.
Yeah, we often hear, Prof, the refrain, right, in other contexts, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. But you say a bad deal is worse than any deal at all.
Yes, because this is not good. I am all for saying if it is an advance, let's do it. This is not an advance. This locks you in further. And in fact, once you write it down, you submit to this and you sign on to this, there is no scope for a better deal at all. So remember, all of these things get locked into place and they're then written in stone for decades. You're stuck with them. If you do this now, you will not have a chance to do anything, even in future pandemics or in other various places where you need new technologies. So we really need to fight this right now.
So tell me, what needs to change in these negotiations? What does this deal need to look like to make it acceptable to people like yourself?
Essentially, it has to cover all intellectual property, without which you're not going to get the additional production. It has to cover not just vaccines, but therapeutics, tests, etc. And it has to be very clear about the time period that is required. It's very vague. Sometimes it's saying it's the duration of the pandemic, whoever defines that duration. Sometimes it says 3 to 5 years. It has to be very clear about that time period. And it has to actually ensure that you are sharing the technology in ways that other producers can actually produce. It limits it. For example, right now it's saying if you are producing more than 10% of global exports, you're not allowed to get the STRIPS waiver.
Right, so that would exclude a country like China, for example, right?
China for sure, but even, let's say even Canada. In other words, it will reduce supply. So countries that don't produce themselves will have less possibilities of importing.
A spokesperson for the US Trade Representative said of this compromise that it offers the most promising path towards achieving a concrete and meaningful outcome, which is probably a sign that Western countries are going to line up behind this compromise. What do you make of that?
I think what we've seen throughout this pandemic is that Western governments have lined up behind their pharma companies. It's really, this does not benefit the people of the Western countries. This does not benefit people anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, Western governments have repeatedly chosen profits over people throughout this pandemic. This is yet another sign of this.
Yeah, you also mentioned, Prof, in your letter that developing countries have experienced the worst effects of COVID-19 and that the crisis is far from over globally, with the possibility still of new variants and possibly further economic harm to those economies. And of course, the death rate is probably going to go up as a result. So I'm glad you mentioned the pharmaceutical companies, the pharmaceutical lobby, which cannot be ignored in these negotiations among member states. What is their role here? And certainly, how do we address them moving forward?
We have to recognize that TRIPS itself is the result of very active lobbying by pharma, digital companies, and finance companies. That's how we got TRIPS in the first place, with all of the rigidities. Now that that's in there, it still had flexibilities. Those flexibilities are actually being reduced. So what this compromise deal does is reduce the flexibilities. It brings in things that are not in TRIPS. Declare every single patent that you might be waiving, which TRIPS does not require. So we really need to confront this head on. We need to make it clear what is going on. I think most people in the world, including in South Africa and in India and elsewhere, don't recognize that this is not about one country versus another country. It is about pharma companies that have tremendous lobbying power over governments, able to influence government decisions over the interests of people.
Prof, I'm sure you understand the nature of how the multilateral system works. When you talk about this negotiation, you're looking at 164 WTO member states that need to reach a compromise, a consensus decision. If one country says no, this thing won't move ahead. What do you make of the nature of the consensus-seeking approach that often is an albatross around the necks of member states?
It's so fascinating that the rules of WTO actually allow for voting, and it has never had a vote. It's always consensus. And we all know what consensus means. It means the powerful can strong arm everybody else into doing what they want. Yes, there is a case for voting. I don't know whether that will help because, the rich countries will simply just either withdraw or not go with the rules, as we have seen repeatedly. But in a case where the rules are being used to prevent good things happening, and that's happening right now in South Africa with the mRNA hub, for example. We have to fight those rules. We have to say, no, there are too many people in the world affected. And too many governments are going along with the companies rather than their own people. So I think it's absolutely essential to confront those rules. Those rules are very recent in origin. They're only about 30 years old. Why 20 years old, really? Why are we deciding that this is inevitable and a force of nature that we cannot change? If we don't change it, we will not be able to confront any of the important challenges facing humanity, not just this pandemic, but future pandemics, climate change, which also requires lots of technology, anything major.
So final word to you, Prof. Your message to President Ramaphosa, no deal.
My message to President Ramaphosa, no deal. He's been very inspiring in his leadership, and I believe he can do it.
Professor Ghosh, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Professor Jayati Ghosh is an economist based at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and was recently appointed to the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism.